Hello, everyone. This is the 156th episode of the Soccernostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle from the 1888 letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interview English author Ms. Susan Gardiner as we discuss her book, Ipswich Town, A History, published in 2013. Ms. Gardner is also the author of the following books: Secret Ipswich, Ipswich Pubs, The Wanderer, The Story of Frank Soo, and my favorite game, Ipswich Town. Welcome, Ms. Gardner.
Thank you.
Can you introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
My name is Susan Gardiner. I'm an Ipswich Town supporter, first and foremost. But actually, I started out as a young woman being more of a cricket fan, actually, because I wasn't encouraged to follow football in my family. I don't think that was just sexism. I think it was just that my father didn't really want to take me along to matches because he was a bit worried about there was a time of hooliganism and so on. I was only taken to one match and I didn't really like it. But years later, I decided to go for one match with my husband, who was an Ipswich Town supporter. And I literally said to him, I'll go with you for one match because a lot of his friends had stopped going when they introduced all-seater stadiums in England because most of his friends liked standing during the match. And so he wasn't going to any matches. And I went along for the one match and that was it. I was hooked. I went to every home match for 22 years after that. Yeah, that's how I got into football. And I really became an accidental football writer. I had no intention to write about football. I wanted to write books, but I wanted to write about history, general history. But I started to write for a fanzine and also for various blogs. And people liked what I wrote. And I was contacted by a publisher, Amberley, who asked me to write a history of Ipswich Town. So that's how it happened.
Can you discuss the format of your book and what makes it different from other Ipswich Town history books?
Right. Well, I actually set out to write something that was different because there were quite a lot of histories of Ipswich Town around. And they generally were just, like starting at the beginning and going to the end, although a lot of them didn't start in 1878 when the club was founded. A lot of them started when the club turned professional in 1936. I was given a sort of maximum word count of 60,000 words, which is really short. And I could have written twice as many words as that. But I was really determined to try and not do the same kind of thing as other people had done. So I decided to do it as a kind of thematic book where each chapter is a different theme. So I've got a chapter on war, I've got chapters called Home and Away, I've got a chapter called Youth, and they address those themes. And then in between those themes, I've got chapters on each of the managers, starting with Scott Duncan, who was manager from the late 30s onwards, and going through to George Burley. And that's when I decided to stop because things went rather wrong for Ipswich Town after George Burley left. So I didn't want it to be too negative.
For anyone who may not be aware, can you describe Ipswich in terms of geography and sociology in the late 19th century at the inception of the club in 1878?
In terms of geography, if you think of a map of England, there's a bit on the east coast that sort of sticks out like a sort of semicircle, jets out into the North Sea. That's known as East Anglia. And the sort of top county is Norfolk. Below that is Suffolk. And at the bottom of the county of Suffolk is Ipswich. Ipswich has always been a port for centuries. And its North Sea trade was mainly with the Netherlands and Belgium, that sort of thing. And it's always had an openness to Europe. And even in medieval times, there were lots of Dutch, German, Belgian people living in Ipswich. A lot of them were brewers because there's been a big tradition of brewing in the town. But until the 20th century, the port was the main importance of Ipswich.
You listed the founding members of the club. What was the common thread?
Between the men's, well, the first and foremost common thread was that nearly all of them went to the same school. They went to, there's a private school in Ipswich, it's still there, Ipswich School, and it's had a great sporting reputation. Most of the founders were there. There's some wonderful photographs of them as founders. They founded it as Ipswich Association Football Club. They wore blue and white strips, but basically they were like cobbled together. No one sort of strip was alike. They all had their own different things that they could get hold of. But they were all friends, I think, and very much from the same social background, quite wealthy, quite privileged, didn't really have to work, and very into the sort of amateur sports ethic that dominated Ipswich for years afterwards.
Can you discuss this amateur ethic of the club and why the club resisted professionalism until relatively late 1936?
That's right, they did. It held the club back, in my opinion, terribly. Ipswich has always had this feeling about the Corinthian spirit, the amateur fair play. And it comes from those individuals, I think, who founded the club. There was three brothers who were very dominant called the Sherrington brothers. They actually donated the land where the team played initially before they moved to Portman Road. So they were quite powerful in terms of the club. And George Sherrington in particular, he was the vice president of the Football Association. So he had a major role in football in England and Wales. And he was absolutely determined to preserve the amateur status of the club, which suited them because they didn't have to work. They could play football when they wanted. But it actually did mean that for most people, talented footballers in the area, they couldn't play for Ipswich Town because they couldn't be amateurs. They had to earn money from the game. And George Sherrington really dug his heels in for years when other clubs were turning professional. Norwich City to the north of us turned professional in 1902. We just clung on and in the amateur leagues. And it was only later in the 1930s when there was real threat from sort of conglomerations of business people in the area who decided that they would, if they couldn't get Ipswich Town to turn professional, they'd start another club. That in the end, the board of directors gave in and agreed to turn professional.
Can you discuss the evolution of the team and its structure until the outbreak of the Great War in 1914?
It was very amateurish, really. I mean, they basically got changed in a local pub and then sort of ran down the road in a football strip to play. They didn't really have proper coaches. They didn't have proper facilities. It was just like you imagine a local amateur club today, really, except they were competing in amateur leagues and doing very well, but they certainly had no professionalism about them. And in fact, there is a story about one of the founding members, Francis Peacock, who was a solicitor in a nearby town, Stowmarket, and one day he was going to play for Ipswich and he missed his train. But basically what he did was he waited till the next train, got changed and ran onto the pitch halfway through the match and just started playing. And it was, I mean, you can't believe anybody would do that in a football match now. But that's what it was like. It was really very shoddy setup in a way.
How did the World War One affect the football club in the duration of the war, and how did the club function in the immediate aftermath?
The First World War, it was a very strange situation, really, with not just with Ipswich, but with football generally in England, because football clubs just carried on playing after the war broke out. They just carried on as normal. And it was only when there started to be serious casualties coming back from the war, both deaths and injuries, that the press started to complain and saying, look, there are all these fit young footballers, they're not joining the army, they're playing football, and this is all wrong. And there was tremendous pressure on footballers around the country to join the army, which many of them did. And that included Ipswich players. I think about 6 or 7 were killed during the war. One also committed suicide because of shell shock or trauma. And there were some injuries. And basically no one who played football for Ipswich Town before the First World War played afterwards. It had just killed their careers. So the club had to start again. They actually advertised for players after the war had ended, and they got people from all over the country applying, all kinds of characters, and people from the local Air Force base and so on played for us. But it was still quite amateurish, and it took a long time to recover from that. And of course, it wasn't long until there was another war either.
And in fact, the Portman Road was requisitioned by the army during the duration
That's
of the
right.
war.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I meant to say that it was requisitioned by the army, and they kept it until 1920, when Ipswich sort of had to sort of threaten them with legal action to get it back. The army used it for parades and training and so on. There are some amazing photographs around of parades of military vehicles going around Portman Road during the war. So yeah, that obviously meant that they couldn't play at all.
Can you describe, after the end of the war, the lead up to professionalism in 1936 and admission to the league in 1938?
Yes, I mean, I alluded to it before, really. I think there built up a lot of pressure from outside, from various sources. There were various businessmen in the area. There was a guy called Nat Shaw who owned the local Greyhound track, and he wanted to start a professional club. And he was one of the people who said, well, if we can't turn Ipswich Town professional, we're going to start another club as a rival, a professional rival to Ipswich Town. As well as that, there was Ivan Cobbold of the Cobbold family, who are very important to Ipswich Town. And he was persuaded, he had started out with the amateur ethic, but he was persuaded that it was best for Ipswich to turn professional. He was very friendly with the family who have been serial chairman of Arsenal Football Club, the Hillwood family. And he went round Arsenal. They took him around Arsenal, showed him all their facilities and what they were doing there. And he was so impressed. He just came back and said, we've got to do that at Ipswich Town now. And I think he got a lot of help from the Hillwoods to do it. And the third strand was the supporters wanted to turn professional. And there was a guy called Leonard Thompson who started the supporters club. He was just a clerk in Ipswich. He started the supporters club, and then they got a petition together, got loads of supporters to sign it, to say, we want to turn professional, we want to have a proper club. It's no longer any good to just remain in this amateur ethic. And I think once the supporters had come out in favour of it, there wasn't really any chance that it was going to remain amateur. And although Sherrington resigned from his positions, he then just moved away and stayed in amateur football, leaving Ivan Cobbold to take over as chairman of the club and move it forward. That was 1936. And then they applied to become members of the Football League. I'm not entirely convinced that there wasn't some shenanigans going on with this, and possibly with the help of the Arsenal chairman again, because we were elected in competition with 2 other clubs, Gillingham and Walsall, who were expected to be elected, but we got some surprise extra votes from somewhere and beat them to it and joined the 3rd Division South of the Football League. I think it also helped that the year before we had sort of stolen the secretary manager of Manchester United, Scott Duncan. The club claimed they'd sort of stolen him away from Manchester United, but whatever happened, he moved from Manchester United to Ipswich Town, and he was extremely useful person to have around, very efficient and shrewd. And I think that helped a lot for us to be recognised as an ambitious club who knew what they were doing.
The Second World War affected the area and the club more than it did in the First War. Can you discuss the reasons?
I mean, Ipswich was quite badly bombed in terms of the physical sort of condition of the town, and a lot of people were evacuated from the area. But I think the main thing from the point of view of the football club is that on the day that war was declared, Ivan Cobbold, who was then the chairman, announced that the club would be closing for the duration of the war and made everybody redundant. So everybody at the club was out of work. He was a military man himself, the captain in the Guards, and I think he felt that it was wrong to play, which is interesting because actually the government was quite keen for football to continue because they thought it was good for the morale of the population during the war. So Ipswich is one of the very few clubs that didn't play football. Most clubs carried on playing friendlies and having guest players from, top players from other clubs coming along and playing to entertain the fans. But Ipswich, it was just nothing for the whole of the war, and probably a little bit longer than that by the time they got everything back again, working again. It was another setback because it was just 1938 we joined the Football League. 1939, Ipswich Town stopped playing for 6 years.
What was the evolution of the industries and the workforce from the 19th century into this post-war era? And you already mentioned the Cobbold family. What was the importance of this family in the area and the club?
I think things didn't really change in terms of the workforce until the late 20th century. I think if you went to Ipswich in 1950, it would be very much like it was in 1850. I mean, Ipswich is quite an industrial town. It had brewing, lots of agricultural engineering, making tractors and lawnmowers and things like that. And it had a big cigarette factory right by the football ground. So it was quite industrial, but it's set in a really rural area, which is purely farming. Nearly everybody in Suffolk outside Ipswich at that time worked in farming, either as a farmer or a farm labourer. Nevertheless, Ipswich has always had a lot of supporters from the countryside. It's not just been from the town. But during the 20th century, farming declined a lot, and there's been obviously industry has also declined, and a lot of them have sort of closed down to be replaced by other industries like insurance and so on. But the one dominating industry in Ipswich was probably brewing, which is where the Cobbolds came in. They moved their brewery to Ipswich in the mid 19th century, and they owned hundreds of pubs in Ipswich and Suffolk. They were major employers. They dominated the club from the start because although they didn't go to Ipswich School, they were still from the same social class as the founders. And the founders invited T.C. Cobbold, who was local MP, to be the first president of Ipswich Town. And there was always a Cobbold on the board of directors, if not the chairman, right through until the 70s, when the last sort of son of the Cobbolds died. So they were extremely influential. I think in many good ways, there's lots been written about the Cobbolds because they have some eccentricities, to say the least, and quite a lot of funny stories. But actually, I think they should be taken very seriously as people who really brought the club through to the top of British football by their support for managers and their selection of wonderful people like Alf Ramsey and Bobby Robson as managers. That was all down to the Cobbold family.
You already mentioned Scott Duncan. In the pre and post World War II era of the club, the Scottish Scott Duncan managed the club. How
Yeah.
was he responsible in the growth of the club?
I think he just galvanized it really from being I described it as shoddy, which is a bit unfair, but from being quite an amateur setup, he was a very, very good administrator. He wasn't a coach. He never picked the team. He just was more of an administrator. He wore a bowler hat to work and he just sort of brought everything together. He appointed coaches. He brought in professional coaches. He brought in all kinds of people to try and build up a professional setup before Ipswich became professional. I don't think they would have probably done it without him, but it's quite hard for people to understand that they used to call them secretary managers, not managers, up until he was replaced by Ramsey. And even when Alf Ramsey came, Scott Duncan stayed on for 3 years to work as a secretary there to help with the smooth transition
Yeah.
between him and the new manager. So he's underrated as his influence on
And
the
I think
club.
you mentioned that he was very careful with money and he made sure the club was financially at a
Yeah.
sound place.
Yeah, I think he was shrewd. I mean, there are stories about him watering down the referee's whiskey and stuff, but I think that actually it was really important to put Ipswich on a sound financial footing because there wasn't really this kind of levels of sponsorship and things that we expect today. Then it was either money coming from the Cobble family or from gate receipts, really. So he did very well to do that, I think.
Of course, the man who changed everything was future England manager Sir Alf Ramsey.
Yeah.
Can you discuss this era culminating with the league title in 1962?
Well, I don't think we've got long enough, but yes, I mean, it's very interesting because the Cobbold family, who were directors then, they wanted somebody with no experience. They didn't want somebody to come in from another club with lots of baggage. Alf Ramsey had been a very good footballer and played for England, but he'd never done any serious coaching apart from abroad during the sort of holidays. It's a mystery, really, why they chose him, but they did. And they supported him. I think the great thing about the directors of the club was that they just supported the manager, whatever, however badly things were, they gave them the time to build a club. And when Alf Ramsey arrived, the team was getting old. They'd been around for years. There were some popular players, but he gradually replaced them with his own players, although he kept a few. He was also lucky because he had two strikers, Ray Crawford and Ted Phillips. Ted Phillips was a local lad from Leiston in Suffolk, and they scored unbelievable amounts of goals. I was looking it up earlier, and Ted Phillips, for example, scored 46 goals in one season, often scored over 30. I mean, we talked today about 20 goals a season strikers in football, but I mean, they were scoring 30 to 40 goals, and same with Ray Crawford. So between them, Ipswich was, I think one of the reasons we were so dominant was because we had these two strikers, but also because Ramsey trained his midfielders, people like Ledbetter and Ellsworthy, who he had inherited, to sort of feed the ball from the wings up to the strikers so that they could score the goals. And they were almost impossible to defeat at times because of this. They started out in the third division south, which is where we entered the Football League. And within a couple of years, we won that league and went up to Division 2. I think it was within 2 years we then won as champions Division 2. And then we went up to Division 1, which is, you can't say it's equivalent to the Premier League, but it was then, it was the top division in the country. And in our first season, 1961-62, we won it. And we were champions of England in our first season, which, you cannot imagine that happening now. We got a lot of scorn for it. We were known as a Cinderella club and expected to go straight back down. It was just familiar. But it was really phenomenal because not only did we go up that quickly, but every time we went up as champions, we didn't go up as second or playoffs, which they didn't have then. But we went up as champions, and we weren't probably the best team in the league, but we were somehow, Alf Ramsey managed to coach his players and get absolutely the best out of them.
There's a sliding doors moment in terms of the England football history because without this Ipswich success, he would have never been the England national team manager
That's
and
right.
obviously the World
Yeah,
Cup title that came with it.
that's right. He wouldn't have, I don't think, unless obviously he may have gone to another club and had similar success. But no, I mean, it was his success at Ipswich that led to the offer to be England manager. And then, of course, winning the World Cup, which nobody else has ever done in England. And I think a lot of people have forgotten exactly what he did, really. We've had two managers then go on to England. Unfortunately, we seem
Mhm.
to lose them when they do well for us.
The post Ramsey years were exemplified with the stagnation under Jackie Milburn and Bill McGarry, who were unable to make any headway. How are these years regarded by the club historians?
I think I might take issue with you there, if I may. With Bill McGarry, he actually got us back up to the first division. So he didn't do that badly. But what happened with him is that he got us up to the first division, and then he decided that he wanted to go to Wolverhampton Wanderers, who he thought were a more ambitious club, and he kind of abandoned us. And so I think that made him quite unpopular with some of the fans. But I don't think he was a failure. With Jackie Milburn, I think it's a terribly sad story. He had only been managing a sort of lower league club, usually, after he retired from football, and he was a fantastic footballer. So everyone thought he'd be a fantastic manager, but in fact, I don't think he was cut out for it at all. He couldn't relate to the players personally, and he was from the northeast, quite a long way from Ipswich. I think he felt he didn't bring his family with him. And I think he was really lonely, isolated. He didn't do well at all. Nothing went right for him really. But I would add that although he didn't do well, he actually did two things for Ipswich, which we should be really grateful for, which is one, he started or improved our scouting system tremendously, which went on to really help Bobby Robson afterwards. Robson was able to take advantage of that. And the second thing was that Jackie Milburn actually started our youth system. We didn't have a youth team before that. Alf Ramsey wasn't interested in having a youth team. So we can thank Milburn for a couple of things, even though he had a really rotten time at Ipswich.
And speaking of the Bobby Robson era, Bobby Robson was appointed in January 1969 to be exact. Though he did not win the league title, his era is perhaps regarded as the golden age of the club with the European adventures,
Yeah.
winning the UEFA Cup in 1981, most notably.
Once again, you need a long time really to do it justice, but he very, very nearly won the league title, and that's one thing that is very sort of sad looking back that they came so close to winning the league title and virtually everything. He actually started really badly. And once again, it was the support of the Cobbold family that kept him at the club because his first couple of years, he didn't do well at all. And he was getting a lot of abuse from the fans, booing and sort of shouting to sack him. And he was called in to see the director, John Cobbold, and thinking he was going to get the sack. And John Cobbold said, "No, I'm going to give you a 10-year contract." So he got that level of support in the face of the fans. And he also had problems with the players
Yes,
who,
and in fact, I was gonna tell you, I was really surprised to learn about the story that you shared about a physical altercation with Tommy Carroll and Bill Baxter. And
well, it's an amazing story because when you think of Bobby Robson, he comes across as such a gentle, kind guy, doesn't he? But you see, the thing is, he comes from a coal mining family, and I think he grew up in a tough area. So although he wasn't a tough man normally, he had those resources to sort of call upon. And what happened was that particularly Bill Baxter had been there for years. throughout the Ramsey era and so on. And he'd been kind of dominant character in the dressing room. And Tommy Carroll and some of the others sort of followed his lead. And they decided they wanted Robson out. And they were doing ridiculous things, like Robson came in one day after Ipswich had lost, and they were sitting drinking champagne, because, sort of like celebrating the fact that their own team had lost. And there were all kinds of other very silly, childish things, really. And it got to the point where I think Robson almost wanted to provoke an incident, and it ended with a physical fight on the floor of the dressing room, with some people joining in with Robson and some people joining in with the other players. And of course, it didn't get anywhere apart from the fact that Baxter and Carroll left the club. And, they obviously couldn't carry on after that.
And the
And
young Mick Mills was appointed captain and
yeah,
yeah, became inspiration for the next decade for the team. Yeah.
that's right. In fact, what happened was it suited Robson, to clear out the old guard who really were holding the club back, and bring in these. And Robson's, one of his great talents was trading in the transfer market, and he was able to bring in all kinds of brilliant young players, and eventually culminating in bringing in the Dutch players, Tyson and Muren, who transformed the club really into playing wonderful football.
Like you mentioned earlier, Bobby Robson would follow Alf Ramsey and become the national team manager. The post Robson era saw the decline of the team and eventual relegations. There would be, in the 90s, there would be 3 seasons in the Premier League, but Bobby Ferguson, John Duncan, John Lyall really failed to improve the team and its status.
I
Would,
wouldn't, I wouldn't include John Lyall in that, because John Lyall did take us up to the first Premier League in 92, 91, 92. But yeah, the other two, certainly, you're right. And I think that once Robson left, because everything broke up really
uh,
after Robson left, but it was his team. He had put his personal stamp on it. The great players that we had went to other clubs, and yeah, it took a long time. We never really got it back, actually, until
yeah, it's
recently.
hard to forget that he was in charge for more than a decade. So
Yeah,
whoever
yeah,
replaced him, it was always going to be a poison chalice. But
yes, that's right.
yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
There was a mini revival of the club under former hero George Burley from the
Yeah,
mid 90s to the early 2000s. In fact, I think he took over the club when they were more or less relegated from a Premier League in the
yeah.
94-95 season, but he stayed on and he brought the team back into the early 2000s, and there was the Champions League qualification in 2001. How do you view this era?
I first started going to watch Ipswich was George Burley era, so it's a reminder of great times for me. The first few years, I mean, he was lucky that the directors were so supportive, because he kept getting us into the playoffs, and we kept losing in the playoffs, and so we were nearly there, but a lot of fans actually turned against him and said, "Oh, we were bottlers. We'd never go up because we couldn't quite reach that level." The support of the directors saying, "Yeah, you keep going, improve every time." And of course, in 2000, we actually did win the playoff final at Wembley and go up to the Premier League. And then once again, we were expected to go straight back down, but in fact, we ended up in fifth place in the Premier League, and, as you say, qualified for Europe, and had a couple of years of great European football, and it was wonderful. But of course, we didn't really. I think it's very difficult to know. I mean, there are criticisms of Burley perhaps not buying in the right players. He had some unfortunate player things happen, like when he signed one player and he was injured the first match that he played, never played again. That kind of thing happened. He wasn't lucky. I don't know. It was also a time when we actually were in financial trouble. That didn't come out till later, but there were problems. David Sheepshanks, our chairman, wanted to build new stands. And I think he was trying to sort of run before we could walk, kind of thing, spending money on new stands when we really needed to consolidate our place in the Premier League. We ended up going into administration shortly after Burley was replaced by Joe Royle, and that was the start of a really miserable era for Ipswich Town. But I rate Burley as one of the great managers, personally.
And by the way, I think I made an error. I said Champions League qualification, but it
It
was
was
UEFA
UEFA
Cup
Cup. Yeah,
qualification.
yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that. In over a century, how has the club been identified with the culture of the region? Has the ethos of the club changed from its inception days?
Ooh, that's a hard one.
Besides professionalism.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I still think Ipswich, until quite recently, I think anyway, Ipswich maintained that Corinthian ideal. We always felt that we wanted to play a higher form of football. Passing football is very important to Ipswich fans, that we don't hoof the ball up the pit, and fair play, which, the season we were relegated from the Premier League last time, we actually won entrance to Europe through the fact that we had fewer red and yellow cards than any other team, which was scant consolation. But in fact, we were still then sort of, it was an important factor, fair play and so on. I think that changed during the Marcus Evans era. We're getting it back now. I think also our current owners have gone back to community involvement, which I know a lot of clubs do it, but it's always been very important. The links between the club and the town and the county of Suffolk, and helping people and, doing the right thing. It's always been an important ethos for the club and important for the fans as well.
Can you describe the concept of the Ipswich way?
Yeah, well, that is probably what I just described, really. To me, the Ipswich way, I think it probably might mean different things to different people, but to me, it's playing passing football, not to the exclusion of scoring goals or anything, but playing good football, fair play, playing up to ideals, being decent. We had a little phase some years ago when we signed some players who just did not fit in to the Ipswich way, people who had been in trouble for all kinds of things, I won't go into, but who were basically thugs or involved in criminality and so on. And a lot of fans got very angry about it because they are not the sort of people that Ipswich traditionally have signed. It's not just the football. We want good footballers, but it's important to Ipswich supporters to have people of good character, people who are decent and buy into the ethos of the club. We've got that back now under Kieran McKenna, he understands that, I think, which is great. But yeah, the Ipswich way really is, I think it goes way back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the Corinthian ideal, but in a professional setting.
So, how do you see the evolution of the club since writing your book over a decade ago?
I deliberately stopped at the end of the Burley era because I didn't want to write about the new owner, Marcus Evans, because I was very unhappy about what he was doing to the club. Looking back, I don't think he was sinister or anything. I think he did want to do well by the club, but he had wrong way of going about it, really. And he made some very bad decisions. He brought in managers who didn't suit the club, didn't fit. People like Roy Keane, who I can only imagine was brought in because he had a famous name. We just went through years of awful football. I mean, I nearly stopped going, which for me was really a statement. But because the football was just so awful, we just weren't getting anywhere. It was like treading water. And actually, when we finally Marcus Evans finally left, we were really in fear of going down to the fourth tier because we were doing so badly. There didn't appear to be any way out until our new owners took over, and it's just transformed the club again. So the last 3 years have been fantastic with the Three Lions and Game Changer, who have taken over the club, put a massive investment in, but also clearly understand the club much better than the previous owner did. That even though they are in America, you would think that they might have more difficulty understanding the culture, but they don't. They seem to have just chosen Ipswich because of our culture and because they like that ethos. So it seems so far to be working really well. And we have a manager I can't speak too highly of, Kieran McKenna. I'd never heard of him when he was appointed. And yet he's been fantastic. He's nearly achieved what Alf Ramsey achieved. I don't think he's going to be quite good as that, but he's definitely got a lot to offer us. I hope he stays.
What's next for you on the pipeline?
Writing wise,
Yes.
I have just sent a manuscript for a book called Ipswich Town, The Glory Years to my publisher, which is covering the Ramsey and Robson eras mainly, which once again, lots of people have written about. So I'm hoping it'll be a slightly different take. I've just written about it in a lot of detail, basically covering every match. So yeah, that's it. And I'm now contracted to write a book, but it's not a football book. It's just a history of Ipswich. So I've got plenty to be getting on with.
In closing, what is the historical legacy of the club in the English football landscape? What
Oh,
makes it stand out against other teams in other regions?
oh, that's really hard. I think it's because we are seen as a small club, as almost as an obscure club, and yet we have achieved so much. I don't think there's another club of our size that has trophy cabinet like ours. You've got clubs in Lancashire where you've got so many clubs: Manchester, Liverpool, Everton, Preston, Blackburn. You've got endless numbers of clubs in one county, and they've got massive amount of fans and support from all over the world. Also, lots of money, and they constantly achieve things. But for a club like Ipswich, where we've struggled to find the money to acquire players and so on, I think we've just periodically gone against the grain, that through sheer ability and talent and striving to do well and luck to have three fantastic managers, at least three. So we stand out, I think, like that. And it's surprising how many people support Ipswich Town who aren't even from the area because of what we have done in the past and our associations with Ramsey and Robson and our achievements in the UEFA Cup, particularly. I mean, I know people who are from all sorts of parts of the world who have been Ipswich Town supporters for years because of the UEFA Cup win. I don't know. It's very hard to say how we fit into the landscape. I don't think we can ever be one of those big clubs. No, I don't. I just don't think we can because of the finances, the way that the Premier League is set up. It's almost impossible for a club like ours to achieve something like European football now. It's just so hard. You're playing against clubs that have players that are costing millions and millions. So we're having a tough season this year. But I think we'll always be remembered as being that sort of little club that's done well against the odds over the years and admired for that.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview.
Thank
Uh,
you.
and our respective contact information and the links to your books are on the blog and podcast uploads. So thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Thank you.